He kneels, not as a god, but as a slave. The Persian king of kings, Shapur the Reversed, places his boot upon the back of the Roman emperor to mount his horse. Valerian, ruler of a world that once worshipped him, now crushed beneath foreign leather and sand. The eagle of Rome trampled. 7 centuries of divine power undone in a single gesture. This is not the fall of a man. This is the humiliation of civilization itself. The year is 260 AD, the moment Rome almost died. The death of an empire rarely begins with invasion. It begins with a betrayal of its own ideals. In 235 AD, Rome witnessed such a betrayal. Emperor Alexander Severus, young, refined, the last descendant of the Severan dynasty, believed that civilization could be preserved through reason, not slaughter. He was a scholar in armour, raised among philosophers and jurists, not soldiers. When Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, he tried to end bloodshed through diplomacy, offering gold to secure peace. It was a gesture of intellect, but to the hardened legions on the frontier it was heresy. They had been forged in conquest, trained to see negotiation as cowardice. In their eyes, the emperor's mercy was weakness, and weakness in a Roman ruler was treason. His men began to whisper. They had followed him into the cold, hungry wilderness, but they saw him feasting on reason while they starved on fear. They wanted a leader who spoke the only language they trusted, the language of steel. From their ranks rose a monster in human shape, Maximinus Thrax, a Thracian giant with hands the size of shields, a peasant who had clawed his way up through brutality and instinct. He could barely read, but he could kill, and in the eyes of the soldiers, that was all that mattered. When the mutiny came, it was swift and merciless. The emperor's tent was surrounded, his own guards turned against him. Alexander begged for reason, but the empire no longer wanted reason. It wanted survival. He and his mother, Julia Mamaea, were slaughtered on the spot, their bodies stripped and left in the mud. That night the torch of Roman civilization flickered and nearly went out. The death of Alexander Severus marked more than a regime change. It marked the death of the illusion that Rome was ruled by law. From this moment forward, no emperor would be safe from the men who were meant to protect him. The Senate, horrified, could only watch as the throne passed to a barbarian in armour, Maximinus Thrax, the first of the soldier emperors, a man of the ranks, not of the blood. He doubled taxes to fund his endless campaigns, crushed dissent with executions, and ruled by fear alone. The marble grace of the Augustan age was replaced by the mud of the frontier. Those who once ruled the world through intellect now obeyed the sword. It was the beginning of a new order, one where emperors would rise not from noble birth but from barracks, from battlefields, from chaos. The elegance of Rome's golden age was gone, and in its place a savage new empire was being born, one that could no longer tell the difference between strength and savagery. In killing Alexander Severus, Rome killed a part of itself. The ideal that reason could govern violence was gone. The empire had chosen the sword over the mind, and from that choice flowed 50 years of blood. Just 3 years after the murder of Alexander Severus, Maximinus Thrax was already despised. His size and strength had made him a god to the legions, but his cruelty made him a monster to the people. He waged endless wars, bled the provinces with new taxes, and demanded worship as if he were divine. The Senate, humiliated and powerless, whispered rebellion. And in Africa, far from the roar of the frontier, a new name was spoken, Gordian. Gordian Thurn was an old man, a philosopher more than a soldier. The local elite, desperate to rid themselves of the barbarian emperor, proclaimed him ruler. For 20 days, Rome dared to hope that wisdom had returned. But the empire was no longer a republic of ideas. It was a machine built on violence. Maximinus marched south to crush the rebellion. Gordian's son fell in battle. The old man, overcome by grief and hopelessness, took his own life. The revolt that began with poetry ended with suicide. The Senate, cornered and terrified, had no choice but to continue the farce. They declared 2 new emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, to replace the dead Gordians. The people rioted, the legions mutinied, and the Praetorian Guard, insulted at being ignored, stormed the palace. In the chaos, both emperors were dragged through the streets and hacked to pieces by their own protectors. Meanwhile, Maximinus himself met his end outside Aquileia. Starved and surrounded, his own soldiers turned against him. cutting off his head and sending it to Rome as an offering of peace. In a single year, 6 emperors had worn the purple, and 6 had died violently. The empire, once ruled by divine right, had become a marketplace of corpses. No oath mattered anymore. The legions now understood their true power. Any man could be emperor, if he could pay. Every general with a loyal army became a potential usurper. Every city with a garrison, a throne room waiting to be seized. The purple robe that had once symbolized eternity was now just another prize to be bought and sold. The Senate called the year 238 the Annus Sexaginta Imperatorum, the year of 6 emperors, but it was more than a curiosity of politics. It was the death of legitimacy itself. The idea that Rome was one, ruled by law and divine favour, had been replaced by an empire of anarchy. Authority no longer descended from heaven, it rose from the ground, bought with silver and secured by fear. When the dust settled, the empire stood, but only just. The frontiers were burning, the treasury was empty, and the soldiers, now aware of their leverage, had tasted the ultimate seduction: power without consequence. From this point onward, Rome would not be conquered by outsiders. It would be eaten from within by ambition and betrayal. And all it had taken to start was 1 year, 6 emperors, 6 deaths, and 1 broken idea that Rome was immortal. By the mid-3rd century, the empire was exhausted. Every province groaned under the weight of tribute and plague. The soil no longer yielded enough to feed its armies. The coins in the treasury had been scraped so thin that they gleamed like lies. In 248 AD, Emperor Philip the Arab, a man of humble origins from Syria, attempted to lift Rome's fading spirit by celebrating the city's 1000th birthday. Across the empire, festivals and games echoed with artificial joy. Fireworks burst above a decaying capital. Bread was thrown to the masses, gold to the soldiers, and prayers to gods who no longer seemed to listen. The empire looked eternal, but the smell of rot already filled its marble streets. Then came the invisible enemy. The plague of Cyprian, named after the bishop who chronicled its horror, swept across the empire like divine judgment. It began in Ethiopia, followed the trade routes through Egypt, and soon reached the heart of the empire. Cities emptied overnight. Families died where they stood, bodies left unburied in temples and streets. The disease was merciless. It consumed not only flesh, but faith. Priests fled their altars, senators abandoned their villas, and soldiers deserted their camps. To the Romans, this was no ordinary illness. It was the gods withdrawing their protection. When Philip was overthrown by his own troops in 249, Decius, a general of old discipline, took the throne. To him, the plague was not merely biological, it was moral. Rome, he believed, had been punished for its impiety. The empire had abandoned the ancient gods for strange new cults, especially the followers of Christ, who refused to burn incense to Jupiter or swear oaths to Caesar. In his mind, the cure was not medicine but sacrifice. He issued an edict that every citizen must publicly worship the traditional gods, and those who refused were to be tortured or executed. The persecution was systematic and brutal. Christians were dragged from homes, priests were burned alive, and entire congregations were sent to the mines. Decius imagined himself a restorer of Roman virtue, but he was fighting ghosts with fire. The plague raged on. The temples overflowed with corpses instead of offerings. The old gods remained silent, and Decius found himself fighting not heresy, but despair. In 251, as if to confirm the empire's punishment, the Goths invaded the Balkans. Decius, desperate to restore Roman honour, led his army to meet them at Abritus. The battle turned into a swamp of chaos. Rain fell, armour sank into mud, and visibility vanished. The emperor, fighting beside his son, was swallowed by the mire. Neither body was ever recovered. The Romans said the earth itself had consumed them out of shame. It was the first time in Roman history that an emperor died in battle against a foreign enemy. The illusion of divine protection shattered. The empire had celebrated 1,000 years of glory, only to drown in its own filth within 3. The people whispered that the gods had turned their faces away, and that perhaps the Christian God, once mocked, had avenged his followers. Whatever the truth, Rome was now fighting an invisible war, not against barbarians or rebels, but against its own decay. Disease had replaced the sword as the empire's executioner. After the mud of Abritus, silence fell across the empire. The legions returned leaderless and broken, dragging disease behind them. Out of that vacuum rose Trebonianus Gallus, a senator turned general who promised stability but delivered submission. His first act was one of humiliation unprecedented in Roman history. Instead of avenging Decius, he negotiated with the Gothic king who had killed him, agreeing to pay annual tribute in gold and grain so that the invaders would stay away. Rome, the empire that had once demanded tribute from the world, was now paying its enemies for mercy. The moral collapse was immediate. Soldiers saw cowardice rewarded. Governors hoarded wealth. The provinces, seeing that Rome's protection now had a price, began to question whether it was worth paying. In the capital, plague flared again, thinning the crowds to a whisper. Gallus, desperate for legitimacy, shared power with his son Volusianus, hoping to found a dynasty. But dynasties no longer existed in a world of shifting swords. Beyond the Danube, a new general, Aemilianus, won a brief victory over the Goths. His soldiers, intoxicated by success, proclaimed him emperor. The message was clear. Victory itself was now the currency of legitimacy. When Gallus heard the news, panic spread through his camp. His men, unwilling to fight another Roman army, turned on him before battle even began. He and his son were slaughtered by their own guards, their bodies abandoned on the roadside. Aemilianus entered Rome as a saviour, hailed as the man who would restore the empire's honour, but the throne was cursed. Within 3 months, his own officers assassinated him in turn, fearing the wrath of a new rival marching from the Rhine. That rival was Valerian, a grey-haired senator of the old school, calm, educated and incorruptible. His arrival was greeted like the return of reason itself. For a moment the empire believed that stability had returned. Yet the damage was already beyond repair. Decades of betrayal had made loyalty impossible. The army no longer fought for Rome, it fought for survival and payment. The people no longer prayed to gods, they prayed for food. Gold had replaced glory, and fear had become policy. Gallus's decision to pay the Goths was not merely a strategic mistake, it was a symbolic surrender. It told the world that Rome no longer believed in its own destiny. The empire that once ruled through awe now ruled through negotiation. The conqueror had become the supplicant. In the villages of the frontier, Roman citizens watched barbarians ride through their burned fields, wearing jewellery bought with Roman tribute. The myth of invincibility was gone. Even the coins that bore the emperor's face were debased, bronze pretending to be silver, value pretending to be strength. The empire had begun to counterfeit itself. The philosophers of the time wrote that Rome was still vast but hollow, like a corpse dressed in imperial robes. The generals murdered each other for a throne no longer worth sitting on, while plague, famine and rebellion chewed through its limbs. The empire had not yet fallen, but it had begun to kneel, and the world was watching. Valerian had risen from the ashes of his predecessors with the quiet dignity of an old Roman senator. Unlike the brutes and opportunists who came before him, he was a man of moderation and reason, a bridge between the ancient republic and the soldiers' empire it had become. His rule began with cautious hope. Together with his son Gallienus, he divided the empire for efficiency. Valerian would rule the east, Gallienus the west. For a fleeting moment it seemed a solution had been found, 2 emperors to hold one collapsing world. But fate had other plans. The frontiers were burning. In the east, the Persians under King Shapur had risen to terrifying power, sweeping across Mesopotamia, plundering Roman cities, and enslaving thousands. In the west, the Rhine frontier was disintegrating under Germanic invasion. The empire was a house on fire, and its emperor was running from room to room with a bucket full of holes. Valerian's letters to the Senate were desperate. He begged for men, money and time, things that no longer existed. In 257, plague returned for the 3rd time, killing soldiers faster than swords could. Armies marched half dead, and the empire's provinces revolted in hunger. To restore divine favour, Valerian ordered new persecutions of Christians, seeing their refusal to honour the gods as the source of the empire's curse. But superstition could not cure collapse. His enemies grew stronger, not weaker. Then came the disaster at Edessa in 260 AD. Shapur, cunning and patient, lured Valerian into negotiations. Weary from years of war, the emperor believed diplomacy might succeed where force had failed. He rode into the Persian camp under truce, escorted only by a handful of officers. There the unimaginable occurred. The King of Kings seized the Emperor of Rome. No army, no legion, no divine thunderbolt came to his rescue. The man who ruled the world was led away in chains. In Persia, Valerian was not simply a captive, he was a symbol. Shapur paraded him before his troops as proof that the gods had chosen the East over the West. Roman prisoners were forced to bow as their emperor walked past, bound and humiliated. Ancient writers claimed that Shapur used Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse, a gesture that erased centuries of Roman superiority in one act of ritual humiliation. Whether or not it happened exactly that way, the image burned itself into history. For Rome, it was worse than death. An emperor might die in battle. That was tragic, but noble. To be captured alive, displayed like an animal, was cosmic humiliation. The Senate fell into silence, issuing decrees without conviction. Coins were minted showing Valerian as a divine figure, but everyone knew the truth. Their god was a slave. Valerian's fate remains uncertain. Some accounts claim he lived out his days as a prisoner, his skin eventually flayed and stuffed with straw as a warning to Rome. Others say he was treated with reluctant respect, allowed to die in captivity. Whatever the end, the meaning was the same. For the first time, Rome had knelt before another power. The psychological wound was irreparable. The aura of invincibility, the myth that had conquered continents, was gone. The emperor was not a god, not even a man above fate, but just flesh like any other, and that revelation would haunt Rome for centuries. When the news of Valerian's capture reached Rome, disbelief turned to despair. The empire had lost not just an emperor, but the illusion of unity. His son, Gallienus, was now the sole ruler of a mutilated world. He was intelligent, cultured, and visionary, but surrounded by chaos. Every frontier burned, every province doubted him, and every general saw in him an opportunity. In the east, with Valerian gone, Persian armies swept across Syria, burning Antioch, one of Rome's greatest cities, as to the ground. But amid the ruin, a saviour rose, Odenathus of Palmyra, a desert prince loyal to Rome but forced to act alone. With a small but fierce army, he pushed the Persians back, reconquered Mesopotamia, and proclaimed himself corrector of the East, the restorer. For the moment he ruled in Gallienus's name, but his loyalty was that of a man who had seen the empire abandon its own. The East was now a kingdom within a kingdom, Rome's mask worn by another. In the West the situation was even worse. Along the Rhine, the legions had not been paid for months, and barbarian raids bled Gaul dry. A general named Postumus, capable, ambitious, and adored by his troops, murdered Gallienus's young son and declared himself emperor of a new Gallic empire. His realm included Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain. It had its own senate, its own coinage, its own gods. Yet Postumus still claimed to be Roman. He didn't wish to destroy Rome, he wished to replace it. By 261 the empire had fractured into three pieces. In the centre, Gallienus ruled what was left of Italy and the Balkans. In the east, Odenathus held the deserts under Palmyra's banner. In the west, Postumus reigned over the Gallic provinces. 3 emperors, 3 Romes, 3 competing truths about what Rome meant. The eternal empire was now a shattered mirror reflecting its former glory. The Senate pretended otherwise. Official decrees continued to praise the emperor's divine wisdom. Statues of Valerian and Gallienus were restored, temples reopened. But the illusion was transparent. Power no longer flowed from the capital. It radiated outward, fragmented and ungovernable. The once mighty empire of Augustus and Trajan had become a federation of warlords. Gallienus, though young, understood the gravity of the moment. He knew that if he tried to fight all fronts at once, Rome would die, so he chose the unthinkable. He did nothing. Instead of waging war on every usurper, he sought survival through patience. He fortified Italy, built new cavalry units to defend the heartland, and waited for exhaustion to destroy his rivals. It was a strategy not of conquest, but of endurance. To his critics, it looked like cowardice. To history, it was genius. While others burned their strength in ambition, Gallienus built quietly, waiting for time to punish the reckless. Yet he paid a terrible price, the loyalty of his men. In an age when victory defined worth, patience looked like weakness. Across the empire, the gods seemed silent. the armies restless, the people lost. But somewhere in the deserts of Palmyra, Odaenathus raised his sword in Rome's name, and somewhere in Gaul, Postumus minted coins bearing the same eagle that had once flown above the Forum. The world had cracked, but even in fragments Rome still glimmered. It would take another generation to piece those shards together, and even then the scars would remain. The empire had not fallen, but it had ceased to be one. Gallienus has often been remembered as weak, a poet in a soldier's world, an emperor who dressed in silk while his empire burned. But this caricature hides the truth. He was not the emperor who destroyed Rome, he was the one who saved its bones from disintegration. Surrounded by betrayal and rebellion, Gallienus did what no one before him had dared. He reinvented power itself. After his father's capture, Gallienus ruled alone, a task no man envied. The frontiers were collapsing under barbarian invasions. The treasury was empty, the legions mutinous. Yet amidst the noise of chaos, he saw something clearly. The old Rome was dead, and only a new kind of empire, faster, harsher, professional, could survive. He began his reforms with ruthless logic. First, he broke with 7 centuries of tradition by excluding senators from the army command. For generations, noble birth had been the ticket to power, but Gallienus had watched too many senatorial generals betray their emperors, trading loyalty for ambition. He replaced them with men from Illyria, rough, unlettered, loyal soldiers who had risen through merit, not lineage. From these men would come the future of Rome, the iron emperors of the next century moulded by necessity rather than birthright. He also created a new military elite, a mobile cavalry reserve, trained to strike at revolts and invasions with lightning speed. The old legions were too slow, tied to static frontiers and obsolete traditions. The new force, based in Mediolanum, Milan, became the empire's heartbeat, an army within the army, loyal only to the emperor. It was the ancestor of what Byzantium would later perfect, a professional, centralized war machine. At the same time, Gallienus tried to heal the spiritual wound that had opened since the days of Decius. Unlike his predecessors, he halted the persecution of Christians, granting them a fragile peace. His reasoning was not moral, but practical. Division weakened the empire more than faith did. For the first time, Christians could worship openly, rebuild churches, and even rise within the bureaucracy. Centuries later, historians would recognize this as the first flicker of religious tolerance in imperial Rome. But peace never lasted long in Gallienus's reign. His every reform was met with betrayal. Generals rose against him like seasons, Ingenuus in Pannonia, Regalianus in Moesia, Macrianus in Syria. Each was crushed, but each cost blood and time. The emperor moved constantly from the Danube to the Alps, from Gaul to Illyria, never resting, never safe. His reign was a moving battlefield. He fought not for glory but for survival, for the idea that Rome could still exist, even if it no longer ruled. He rebuilt cities, reminted the currency, restored discipline. He was mocked for his taste in philosophy, for surrounding himself with artists, for refusing to indulge in executions. But these were not the acts of weakness. They were the last gestures of civilization clinging to dignity amid barbarity. In 268, while besieging the usurper Aureolus near Milan, Gallienus received news that a barbarian raid threatened the frontier. He rushed to prepare a counterattack, unaware that the alarm was false, a trap set by his own officers. That night, as he rode into camp, he was surrounded by his generals, men he had raised to power, men he had trusted. A spear struck his chest. He fell, without ceremony, gasping his last orders, "Let my mother and children live." In the morning, his assassins crowned Claudius, commander of the Illyrians, as emperor. The man Gallienus had trained to defend Rome now stood over his corpse. The irony was brutal but fitting. Gallienus's reforms had worked, too well. He had built a new empire, but it could not save him. Rome had survived because he taught it how to adapt. He died because he still believed it could be fair. Gallienus was not the last emperor of the old world. He was the first of the new. His death marked the birth of an empire of iron, ruled by men of war instead of men of words. The philosopher had forged the soldier's future and paid for it with his life. Claudius II was everything Gallienus was not, and yet he was Gallienus's legacy. A soldier of the Illyrian school, born among the cold stones of the Balkans, Claudius was hardened by hunger and battle. His men called him Gothicus, the Gothic killer, though that name would come later, earned in blood. When he took power in 268 AD, the empire was a dying beast, beset by a new storm, the largest invasion in Roman history. The Goths had crossed the Danube in numbers no one could count. Some said 300,000, others 500,000. They came not as raiders but as a nation on the move, bringing wagons, families, herds. Their fleet, hundreds of ships strong, swept across the Black Sea, ravaging Greece and the Balkans. Cities that had stood since the age of Pericles fell in flames. Temples were stripped, women enslaved, marble turned to ash. The empire that once conquered the world now fought for its breath. Claudius met them at Naissus in modern-day Serbia. It was a battle not of generals but of civilizations. The Gothic horde, vast and furious, surrounded the Roman army. For days both sides fought without rest. Arrows darkened the sky. The ground turned to mud from blood and rain. Claudius, tall and silent, fought among his men, refusing to command from a distance. When the Goths attempted to encircle the Romans, he feigned retreat, then turned his cavalry in a perfect ambush. The slaughter that followed became legend. When the sun set, 50,000 Gothic corpses lay scattered across the field. The Roman dead were uncounted, but victory was Rome's. For the first time in decades, the eagle had risen again. Claudius was hailed as a hero, a saviour, a second Trajan. The Senate awarded him the title Gothicus Maximus, and poets sang of him as the man who avenged Valerian and Gallienus. Yet victory carried its own poison. The plague, the same unseen killer that had haunted every emperor since Decius, struck again, spreading through the army like smoke. Men who had survived swords now fell coughing in their tents. Claudius himself grew feverish. Even as his strength failed, he continued to govern, issuing orders from his cot, planning campaigns he would never lead. He died in 270 AD, at the height of his fame, still dreaming of restoring the empire's unity. The soldiers buried him quietly, fearing mutiny if his death became known too soon. When word finally reached Rome, there was mourning but also relief, for Claudius's death did not unleash chaos as before. His reforms held. The men he promoted were loyal, disciplined, and ready to continue his work. From that circle of Illyrian officers would come the last great emperors of the ancient world, Aurelian, Diocletian, Constantine. Each would build upon Claudius's victory, shaping the empire into a fortress that could outlive its heart. The Goths, too, remembered Naissus. They retreated into legend, but their hatred endured. Centuries later, when they returned to conquer Rome, they would carry with them the memory of Claudius, the man who broke them. For Rome, Claudius's triumph was more than revenge. It was a moment of resurrection. After half a century of humiliation, the empire had proved that it could still strike back. The disease of cowardice had been purged, at least for a generation. But victory did not heal the empire's soul. The fields of Naissus were both grave and cradle. The grave of the old Rome that bled for glory, and the cradle of a new one that would fight for survival. Claudius's reign was a heartbeat between death and endurance, a breath between centuries. From the smoke of Claudius's pyre rose one final soldier, one last flame in a world of ashes, Aurelian. Born of poverty in the rugged hills of Illyria, he was not of noble blood but of iron will. His face was marked by scars, his voice low and absolute, his discipline legendary. The legions called him manu ad ferrum, hand to steel. He had served under Claudius, learned from Gallienus, and watched the empire's heart rot beneath gold and fear. When the generals lifted him upon their shields in 270 AD, they did not crown a ruler. They forged a weapon. The empire he inherited was little more than a memory stretched across ruins. In the east, the desert queen Zenobia of Palmyra ruled over Syria and Egypt, calling herself Augusta, minting coins with her face beside her young sons. In the west, the Gallic empire of Postumus's successors still stood, claiming to be the true Rome. Between them lay famine, banditry, and despair. Aurelian faced not one war, but 10 at once. Yet he moved like a storm. He struck first at the barbarian tribes that had breached Italy's borders. In the shadow of the Alps, he crushed the Juthungi and Vandals, reclaiming lost ground with a speed unseen in decades. When he entered Rome, his first act was neither triumph nor festival. It was fortification. He ordered the construction of vast defensive walls encircling the capital, a project unseen since the days of the Republic. The message was clear. Rome was no longer eternal. It needed walls to survive. Then, with methodical fury, he turned east. Zenobia, the proud and educated Queen of Palmyra, had built a dazzling empire out of the ruins of Valerian's captivity. She styled herself as the heir of both Cleopatra and Alexander, rode among her troops in armour of gold, and ruled from Antioch to the Nile. But Aurelian saw in her brilliance a mirror of Rome's arrogance, beauty without discipline, ambition without unity. In 272 AD, he marched across Asia Minor, crushing resistance with cold precision. At Imal, his cavalry feigned retreat under the desert sun, drawing Zenobia's horsemen into exhaustion before surrounding and annihilating them. At Emesa, her final army broke. Zenobia fled across the Euphrates, disguised, seeking Persian aid, but she was captured before she crossed the river. The queen who had dared to rival Rome was brought before Aurelian, silent and unbroken. Ancient writers say she was paraded in golden chains in Rome's triumph, her gaze defiant even in defeat. Aurelian spared her life, a rare act of mercy in an age of vengeance, but her empire was reduced to dust. Next came the West. The Gallic emperors, emboldened by decades of separation, still ruled Britain and Gaul. Aurelian, weary yet relentless, crossed the Alps again and met them at Chalons. The battle was brutal and decisive. The Gallic army was shattered. Their emperor Tetricus surrendered. Legend says he whispered to Aurelian, "Deliver me from my own men." Aurelian, understanding the curse of command, pardoned him and his son. With that, after 50 years of division, the empire was whole again. Not healed, but bound together by force. But unity came at a price. Aurelian's reforms were as fierce as his wars. He purged corruption with executions, restructured the coinage, and established a state cult to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, to restore faith in divine order. He envisioned Rome reborn under the light of a single god, its soldiers and citizens united by a common flame. His empire would not rest on memory or myth, but on discipline and fear. In 5 years, Aurelian achieved what a century of emperors had failed to do. He rebuilt walls, reclaimed provinces, and restored dignity. Yet, as always in Rome, the knife waited where loyalty knelt. In 275 AD, while preparing a new campaign against Persia, his secretaries falsely accused him of planning a purge. His own officers, terrified, ambushed him on the road. He fell beneath their blades, his blood soaking the dust of Thrace. The man who had saved the empire died without a tomb, betrayed not by enemies, but by fear, the same fear that had haunted Rome for a century. His killers, realizing their mistake, were said to have built him a shrine and begged forgiveness. The empire mourned him as it had mourned none since Augustus. Aurelian's death closed the age of the soldier emperors, a half-century of blood and rebirth. He left behind an empire smaller, poorer, but alive. His reforms laid the foundation for Diocletian's order, for Constantine's empire, for the survival of Rome not as a city but as an idea. When the sun set on his reign, the world looked different. The Rome of marble dreams was gone. In its place stood the Rome of iron, scarred, disciplined, enduring. The empire had not fallen, only transformed. Its eternity was no longer divine but human, bought with pain, betrayal, and the blood of 6 emperors in one cursed year. The century of chaos had ended, but the silence it left behind was not peace. It was the sound of history catching its breath, before beginning again.